An important functionality in C++ is the ability for a class to inherit data variables and functions of another class, or even multiple classes. This is useful as it allows us to reuse existing code and class definitions and forces us to create structured and extendable code. So let's look at inheritance. I'm first going to define a function, or rather, I'm first going to define a class shape, and it has public functions called setWidth and setHeight. So void setWidth in W, width equals W. I'm also going to define protected variables width, int width, and int height. And these are going to be defined as protected because later on you'll see that another class is going to inherit these variables, and if they're set to private, it'll never be able to inherit it, but if it's set to protected, it will be able to inherit these variables, and it can treat those variables as if it's private as well. So set width, we go back to that, and then we're also going to set height, set the height, so void set height, and it receives int h and assigns it to height. So that's our class shape. Close it with a semicolon. I will also define a class rectangle. So class rectangle. And this class is going to inherit from shape. So I'm going to specify public to shape, which means that all public elements or public members of shape will remain public, and everything else will remain as they are. So protected stays as protected, and private by default always stays as private. So class rectangle inherits from public shape, and it has an additional function, public function, called, it's a getter function into area, and it returns the width and the height. So I'm multiplying the width and the height and returns that value. Notice that I'm not going to define any variables because it's going to be inheriting the protected variables from shape, width, and height. And it's able to access it, or should be able to access it, and once getArea is called, perform the multiplication. So let's look at this, an example of this. So I'm first going to define rectangle, our class rectangle rect, and set its width 5, and I'm also going to set the height of 7. And I want to check that everything's working, that my base class shape works as I expect it to, setting the variables width and height, and my derived class rectangle, so this is a derived class, rectangle, will inherit from the base class shape the width and the height, as well as the functions set width and set height, and we'll be able to calculate the area from the inherited width and height variables. So I'm going to check that and did that. Area. The rect object is going to call the getArea function. And we can see that 5 times 7 is 35. 5 and 7 were set to variables width and height, and we were able to call it through our getArea function from our derived class. And with our inherited elements width and height multiplied and the area calculated. So that's an example of inheritance. We can inherit from multiple classes. I'm going to define a class VShape, and it's going to have a protected member int depth, and it will have public functions to set that depth. So void set depth, and to receive a variable integer d and set depth to d. And what I'm going to do is also allow my rectangle to inherit from VShape. So I'm also going to specify that's public, so all its public elements stay public, its protected elements stay protected. Public VShape. And I'm also going to create a new function that returns get volume. And it will return width times height times depth. So my new function is going to utilize the members of shape with width and height, from where which width and height comes from, and it's also going to utilize depth, which comes from VShape. So it's going to combine information that inherited from two base classes. And I will set the depth to be 2 and call the get volume function to calculate the volume. As you can see, that worked. We managed to calculate the volume from two base classes. So we're able to create a derived class rectangle by inheriting from two base classes, public shape and public VShape.